This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Ethiopia's prime minister vows to crush what he calls enemies of his government amid threats by rebels to advance to the country's capital. Sudan's ousted prime minister lays out his terms of engagement before any dialogue with the military. And we look at the big challenge of financing climate change mitigation efforts to rescue the planet. Hello and welcome. You're watching Africa Live. We're coming to live from Nairobi. I'm Hannah Viviers, and here with the very latest in business is Rama.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Here's what's coming up in business news. The IMF nears a debt deal with cash-strapped Zambia. We'll have the details on that. And economic activity has rebounded in East Africa's largest economy after the removal of most pandemic restrictions. We'll have the details on those stories and lots more coming your way in the next 30 minutes. For now, let's start with the latest in current affairs with Hannah.
Thank you for that, Rama. We'll begin the hour with a hard-hitting statement by the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who has pledged to vanquish his government's enemies. He made the remarks on the one-year anniversary of the start of the war in the Tigray region. A moment of silence was observed at a candlelit ceremony to commemorate those killed on November the 3rd of 2020. The conflict has now made the Ethiopian government to impose a 6-month state of emergency. Tigrayan forces have indicated that they would advance on the capital, Addis Ababa, after claiming to have taken significant territory in the northern part of Ethiopia. However, the Prime Minister insists government troops will protect the country's sovereignty.
This pit, which is dug very deep, will be where the enemy will be buried, not where Ethiopia disintegrates. We will bury this enemy with our blood and bones and make the glory of Ethiopia high up again.
Well, since war broke out between Ethiopian federal troops and the Tigray People's Liberation Front in November of last year, the conflict is reported to have led to hundreds of deaths. An estimated 400,000 people have since been plunged into famine, while more than 2.5 million people were forced to flee their homes. Jane Kio takes a look at some of the key moments of the conflict.
On 4th November 2020, Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed sent troops into the northern region of Tigray, accusing the Tigray People's Liberation Front of mounting surprise attacks on military bases in the area. On 14th November 2020, the TPLF fired rockets at 2 airports in the Amhara region, and at the Eritrean capital Asmara, the rebels accused Eritrea of sending soldiers into Tigray. By the end of November 2020, Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed told Parliament that operations in Tigray had ended and his soldiers were in control of the capital Mekelle. But things were not as good on the ground, it seemed, as tens of thousands of civilians moved east, deeper into Tigray in March 2021. The fleeing Tigrayans accused the Amhara forces of rape, killings and looting, accusations that the Amhara region officials denied. By this time, the conflict had raised alarm bells among the international community. On 23rd March, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed confirmed for the first time that Eritrean troops had entered Tigray after months of denials from both nations. On June 11th, the United Nations reported that 350,000 Tigrayans were experiencing famine in the region. By June 24th, an airstrike in Tigray's town of Togoga killed at least 51. The Ethiopian army says it hit combatants. On June 29th, the Tigrayan forces took control of Mekelle. By July 13th, Tigrayan forces pushed south and west into land claimed by neighboring Amhara region. On September 29th, food aid started trickling into the Tigray region. And on October 11th, Ethiopia launched a major offensive aimed at pushing Tigrayan forces out of Amhara and Afar regions. Jinkeo, CGTN.
For the very latest on this, let's go to Giram Chala, who is in Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa. Hi, Giram. The Ethiopian Prime Minister talking very tough following those threats by the rebels to march in the capital. How is Abiy Ahmed's calls to citizens to take up arms being received, Giram?
Well, Hannah, across the country, there seems to be some sort of motivation to perhaps join the National Defense Force, according to the state media, that is, and also the Addis Ababa city administration. We've been hearing that the youth are now coming in their numbers and trying to register to be enlisted and join the Ethiopian National Defense Force, and will be going to different camps, training camps tomorrow. This is a press release also came from the Addis Ababa City Administration Mayor's office itself. So in general terms, our observation is that people seem to be motivated with this call of the Prime Minister to defend their nation from the rebel group. But from the TPLF side as well, they are calling on the Ethiopian people to ignore the call of the Prime Minister and accept what they are proposing of removing the government and also forming an interim government from there. Communication is hard to establish, Hannah. We have to say this again and again, as verifying information from that regional state is hard. So in general terms, the Prime Minister's call seems to be accepted by the majority of the people in the country.
So, Giram, what we've also heard is the African Union Commission expressing concern by the escalation of military confrontations in Ethiopia. Is the call for dialogue, Giram, likely to be heeded this time around?
First of all, Anna, this is not the first time that the African Union called for a dialogue to happen. As you remember, former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo has been assigned to create some sort of middle ground between the two parties, the TPLF and the government, so that they can come around for a roundtable discussions, so that this conflict, which claimed thousands of lives, can be, at the end of the day, solved peacefully. That didn't work, and the call came back now as things are escalating in the northern part of the country. So Musa Faki Mohammed, the chairperson of the commission, has called on all parties to cease fire and also respect human rights. He called on the parties again to sit down for a dialogue to resolve this conflict peacefully. So unfortunately, what we see on the ground and our observation, experts' observation, and also based on the calls that are being made from the Prime Minister and also from the TPLF and OLA side, it looks like a peaceful dialogue is not going to take place anytime soon, unless and otherwise in the next perhaps month or so, we'll see some differences in ideology or stand. But for now, unfortunately, we can only report that war is ongoing and it has intensified by the day.
Thank you so much for that report. Giram Chala speaking to us from Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa. Well, meanwhile, the United Nations and Ethiopian human rights teams have jointly published a report that accuses both sides in the conflict of committing atrocities. These include torture, killings of civilians, gang rapes, and arrests based on ethnicity. Here's more in that report.
The investigation covers the year-long conflict in Tigray region. The UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights and Ethiopia's Human Rights Commission found both parties culpable.
We have reasonable grounds to believe that during this period, all parties to the Tigray conflict have committed violations of international human rights, humanitarian and refugee law. Some of these may amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity.
The report draws on 269 interviews, many containing graphic details.
While the majority of the violations documented between November 2020 and June 2021 appear to have been committed by Ethiopian and Eritrean forces, we have since then seen an increasing number of allegations of human rights abuses by Tigrayan forces.
The shelling and airstrikes have killed and injured dozens of civilians. The conflict has led to unlawful executions, torture, a large-scale displacement, and over 400,000 in need of humanitarian assistance.
Various acts of sexual and gender-based violence, including rape, gang rape, intentional transmission of HIV virus, were committed by all parties to the conflict. Women and girls whose male family members were Tigrayan combatants were targeted by the EDF, the Eritrean forces, and wives of the ENDF, the wives of the Ethiopian forces soldiers.
It is not clear whether the report's findings could form the basis for legal action. Ethiopia and Eritrea are not members of the International Criminal Court, so it has no jurisdiction here. Noktula Shabalala, CGTN.
Ethiopia has responded to that report of human rights violations in the war with the TPLF. In a statement posted on social media, Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed thanked the country's Human Rights Commission as well as the UN Office for Human Rights for conducting a joint, credible investigation under difficult circumstances. He added that the joint team found that claims of a genocide were lacking factual basis. The statement further says the government has not been using starvation as a weapon of war against the people of Tigray, and the allegations by the enemy are aimed at misinforming the international community. The government acknowledges that the report indicates that some violations were committed by its own troops, and authorities are committed to bring the perpetrators to book through military tribunals. We're staying with the situation in Ethiopia. Earlier, we spoke with Martin Plaut, a senior researcher at the University of London. Among questions we asked him was whether he believed the military option was the only way forward for the country, or if there might still be room for negotiations between Ethiopia and the TPLF.
So this is a really appalling situation. And I think, far from hundreds dying, we're closer to tens of thousands of people who've already been killed in this war, which is the largest global war taking place right now, with something like 600,000, 700,000 people fighting each other. I think at the moment, it's highly likely that the military is the way that this will be settled. But of course, at the end of the day, it is always necessary to talk, even if it's only in the form of a surrender. So, of course, negotiations should always be given a chance if it is possible. Nothing is worse than war in that sense. But the situation at the moment is on the ground with one town after another falling to the rebel advance. Well, of course, the African Union should be concerned about fighting anywhere, but it has been really marginalized in the entire war, which has now been going on for a year. It began on the 3rd, 4th of November last year. And it was marginalized by the Ethiopian government, who refused to accept the mediators who had been appointed by the African Union. And once that happened, there wasn't much role for the African Union. And it has been really left to outsiders, the United States in particular, to try and help, and President Obasanjo of Nigeria to act as a mediator. But they haven't got very far.
We head over to Sudan now, where ousted Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok says he wants to return to the state of affairs before the military took over as a condition for any sort of dialogue. Hamdok denies reports that he's agreed with the military to lead a new government. According to him, he will only cooperate to reach a settlement when those arrested following the army's takeover are released and governing bodies are restored. Meanwhile, several mediation efforts are underway. The African Union's envoy has arrived in the capital, Khartoum, for talks. This comes just over a week since Sudan's top general locked up political leaders and seized power, sparking mass protests and a deadly crackdown. Well, as we mentioned earlier, it's been a little more than a week since the military took over power in Sudan. The UN Security Council has been urging generals and political powers in the country to begin talks and to put an end to the crisis. Meanwhile, the UN Special Envoy in Sudan has expressed hope that mediation talks could soon bear fruit. Reporting from Sudan's capital, Khartoum, here's Naba Muhyiddin.
Mediation efforts are underway to find a solution for Sudan's political crisis. But before the military takeover, there was political polarization between the transitional counterparts. Pro-military groups wanted the military to seize power and appoint a new government, while pro-democracy supporters wanted civilian leaders to take control. After the military's power grab, which saw Prime Minister Hamdok detained, residents of the capital Khartoum are still divided.
When we rallied in 2019, we protested against al-Bashir and his Islamic military regime. Hamdok was doing great steps towards democratic change. We wanted democracy and a civilian rule, and can't accept to get back to dictatorship.
The generals should form a government out of technocrats, and then the political party should have time to be prepared for elections. Hamdok and the political parties weren't elected. They came in certain circumstances, and they ruined it.
Mass demonstrations erupted over the weekend. 4 protesters were killed and 10 were injured in clashes with authorities, according to Sudan's Doctors' Committee. Analysts like Uthman Mergani think the reinstatement of the transitional government can be a solution.
It's not logical to sustain democracy out of a military coup. Even if we believed the military want to save the country, showing goodwill by releasing the detained politicians is the first step towards the solution. Things should get back to a day before the takeover.
Many internal and international efforts continue to contain the dispute in Sudan, but generals and politicians are clinging to their decisions. Prime Minister Hamdok has refused to be part of the military administration and is sticking on his legitimacy, but the generals insist on forming a new government.
Although many businesses have resumed work a week after the military takeover, there is a cautious silence in many streets of the Sudanese capital. People here are awaiting solutions to end the political turmoil. Naba Muhiddin, CGTN, Khartoum, Sudan.
Well, some observers say Sudan's military leader Abdel Fattah al-Burhan sees involvement of ousted Prime Minister Hamdok in a new administration as key to winning credibility. But analysts in Sudan say there are still pending issues to be discussed in order to move the country beyond the political crisis.
Despite the difference in attitudes between the civilian and the military component, there are positives to accepting mediation. Hamdok still accepts any mediation that reaches him, whether it is local or international mediation. And on the other hand, al-Burhan also said clearly that with Hamdok's nomination again for the Council of Ministers, they will work to overcome any reservations. So in terms of the general structure with regard to the initiatives, there is consensus. But in terms of the content of the initiatives and their options, there are still pending discussions in which it is difficult to reach solutions.
Latest reports indicate the formation of a government in Sudan is imminent. Brigadier General Al-Tahar Abu Haja, an advisor to the military leader Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, says all internal and external initiatives to achieve national interests are under consideration. Let's head over to the Democratic Republic of Congo now, where a group of rebels have attacked several areas in the eastern city of Bukavu. A gunfire exchange between the attackers and defense forces is reported to have killed 6 assailants and 2 soldiers. According to South Kivu Province's governor, about 36 militants have been captured so far. It's not yet clear which militia group was behind the attack, but local authorities blame a rebel group called the CPC 64. Investigations are underway. Well, let's now take a short break and return. More in Africa Live, including we'll look at the big challenge of financing climate change mitigation efforts to rescue the planet. And the existential threats of climate change on the African continent, from perennial droughts and famine. Welcome back. You're watching Africa Live. Well, to our continuing coverage of the UN climate talks, also known as COP26, our correspondent Andrew Wilson delves into the challenge of financing strategies for reversing the effects of climate change.
In the end, climate summits are all about the money, and with the leaders gone, the finance teams can now get to work. The problems are constant. When will the wealthy countries properly subsidize the greening of the planet that they polluted? From the UK, a pledge that big firms will be obliged to demonstrate their plans for climate change targets by 2023, with the US on board as well.
Today, I'm announcing that the UK will go further and become the first ever net zero aligned financial centre. This means we are going to move towards making it mandatory for firms to publish a clear, deliverable plan.
I agree we must all do more, and the United States is stepping up. President Biden has already announced that we're quadrupling our international climate finance for developing countries by 2024 to more than $11 billion.
Also, the announcement that 450 companies from across the global business spectrum, firms that control a staggering $130 trillion, will now align themselves to the 1.5-degree global temperature rise, so-called blended finance.
There are facilities that are being developed that can do this. We need to scale them dramatically. Quite frankly, facilities that do not scale up to 100 billion a year in additional flows aren't relevant to the scale of the problem.
We have a long way to go on coverage, but the shift in integrating carbon price is there, and we are working very hard to support countries to take that shift.
At the start of the conference, the UN chief, Antonio Guterres, warned of empty promises, a deficit of credibility, he called it, a surplus of confusion over targets. In other words, who's going to police these impressive-sounding pledges and test their authenticity? The United Nations, governments, the companies themselves, or a special panel? That's a debate that many here feel is already long overdue. The protest groups have their own position on conference promises and see it as their role to challenge them, with demonstrations like this one at a nearby oil refinery.
We want to hear that their actions are appropriate with the emergency we're in. We don't want to hear more talk. We don't want to hear more pledges for 2030, for 2035, for 2050. We need action immediately, right now.
Finances will long remain a troubling sticking point as poor and rich try to collaborate without losing out. The sentiment is positive, and wealthy figures like Bill Gates are never far from events like these. But the occasional reference to COP27 so early in the process suggests some early cans are already being kicked down the road. Andrew Wilson, CGTN, Glasgow.
We're staying with the summit, and John Beaver is standing by for us in Glasgow. John, thank you so much for joining us on Africa Live. What have been the key highlights of Wednesday's COP26 sessions?
Well, as we've just been hearing there, today really has been all about the finance. The world leaders have all gone home, and it's been left to those men and women in charge of the money to try and work out how they can fund everything that has been promised. And again, as we were hearing there, plenty of people actually not particularly impressed with what's been said. There's not enough in the way of firm promises and exactly where this money is going to come from. We've been hearing, for example, from the UK Chancellor Rishi Sunak. He's been talking about London being this green hub, but yet at the same time he admitted that the money for the developing world is not going to hit the $100 billion a year that they've been promising for years and that they failed to deliver. So very much mixed messages in terms of what's being achieved here.
Well, John, we know the COP26 continues on Thursday. What can we expect to dominate the agenda then?
Well, we're going to be moving away from finance today, and tomorrow is more focused on energy. It's going to be looking at how we move away from a carbonised economy, moving into things like more renewable energy, which is obviously very easy in practice, but how you actually do that is a bit harder. We've heard a bit about this funding that's going to be going to South Africa, and that's going to be aimed at improving green energy across Africa as a whole and cutting carbon emissions. So expect to hear more about those sorts of things tomorrow, and also expect to hear, you know, the sort of policies that politicians like because they're very popular, the move away from petrol and diesel cars to electric, more solar panels, things like that. I expect we're going to hear a lot more about that as the people who are here keep trying to persuade everyone that they are doing a good job and that they're managing to make progress when it comes to tackling climate change.
Thank you so much for all that, John. John Beaver speaking to us from Glasgow. Well, climate change is pushing poverty levels higher in parts of rural Kenya. The government has declared drought in parts of the country, even as the meteorological department gave a bleak outlook for the expected rainy season this month. CGTN's Penina Kariba brings us more from Kitui, one of the counties in Kenya severely affected by drought.
The expanse that greets you in Mithikwani village in Kenya's Kitui County, a vast area of parched earth and dried up trees. It is only mid-morning, but temperatures here are punishing. There is not a single speck of green in sight. This is the landscape that covers most of the county, located about 180 kilometers east of Nairobi. On this hot morning, Priscilla Mweni is getting started on her day. It is a standard routine that she follows each day, and most of the work involves fetching water. In Kitui County, water is a scarce commodity which families spend hours looking for. Mweni, however, is lucky. She doesn't have to walk for miles to get it. Just a few minutes walk from her house is a borehole, but she says it wasn't always there.
I would wake up before 6 a.m. I wouldn't even light the fire. I would load up the donkey and hit the road looking for water. I would walk about 10 or 12 kilometers. Once I got there, I would find other people waiting to fetch the water. We would queue for very long hours. We would have our livestock with us and make sure they first drink the water, and then fill up our jerry cans and load them up again on the donkey for the journey back home. I would arrive at about 1 p.m. That's when I would cook breakfast. The children would go to school in the morning without eating anything.
To save herself from a daily 12-kilometer trek, she would use the water sparingly. As for the livestock, they would go for 2 days after that without drinking any water. She wouldn't do the laundry, instead opting to only wash a few essential clothes. That way, the water would last a few days. The county is classified as a semi-arid region. In a year, it receives roughly 71 centimeters or about 20 inches of rainfall.
Kitui County receives 2 seasons of rain in a year. There's the first season, which locals call the long rain season, which begins in March and ends in May. And then there's a second season, which begins in October to December. But this year, the first season of rains failed. The end result, dry rivers such as this one. It is one of the 3 main rivers in this area. The local chief tells us the last time water flowed in this river was a year ago. That drought is now pushing the local community further to the brink.
The Kenyan government has listed the county among 11 others currently experiencing drought. The local chief tells us the situation is becoming difficult to handle.
Some of them are small-scale farmers. So if the rain fails, I don't understand how the situation will be, not unless we cry for the government to assist.
The lack of water has led to a loss of livelihoods. Mutinda Muyuma is a small-scale farmer who had ventured into onion farming. He tells me he planted the onions on this 1-acre piece of land. Unfortunately, due to a lack of water, they all dried up. Now, he's hoping the upcoming rainy season will be on time and plans to plant maize and beans. Livestock too are feeling the pinch of the drought. There's not much for them to eat or drink. Some people have stored up a bit of reserves for their animals, dry maize stalks stacked up on trees, given to the animals in small rations. But residents of this village count themselves lucky. They're among a few villages in the county that have benefited from a Caritas project, a development wing of the Catholic Church, to provide water. They have so far dug 4 boreholes in the area from where locals get a constant supply of water at a meager fee of about $5.
There are times when in our normal engagements with the farmers, we identify a water need. Then from there, we normally engage government professionals to do geology, designs, and then for drilling, we contract, full contract. Then we remain with the works of supervision and ensuring that the communities are part of the whole process, because after the project, we normally hand over the project back to the community.
The boreholes run on solar power, which is plenty here. They're also cheap to maintain. That constant supply of water has transformed parts of this county. Just 18 kilometers away from Mithikwani village, we find Philip Musyoka tending to his crops, a stark contrast to much of the county. He grows everything from the staple maize to fruits and vegetables.
For us, we're not experiencing the drought because we're using the borehole to farm. We have enough to eat and we sell the surplus.
This small piece of land is a lifeline for Philip and his family. With a reliable water source throughout the year, he's able to farm a variety of vegetables and fruits. It's a good indicator of the potential Kitwe County has to become food secure.
Back in Mithikwani village, Mweni is also planning to farm vegetables. She says she planted these trees to test how well they would grow. She is pleased with their progress and is convinced that she can grow whatever crops she likes. Small steps, but ones that make a difference between life and death in places such as this one. Steps that restore human dignity and spur socio-economic development. Steps that most people in Kitui County hope can be possible to make. Penina Karibe, CGTN, in Kitui County, Kenya.
We head over to Nigeria now, where emergency officials are still searching for survivors at the site of a 21-story building which collapsed in Lagos on Monday. Authorities have now confirmed that over 20 people were killed when the building came crashing down. Some victims have been rescued alive. Relatives of those still believed to be trapped are asking the government to speed up rescue efforts. CGTN's Deji Badmosi brings us the latest.
A relative of one of the victims who is still unaccounted for, believed to be still trapped under the rubble at the collapsed building site. He says his brother, who had just returned from the United States, had been inspecting the building with the developer with the hope of buying an apartment there when it suddenly collapsed. And since then, nothing had been heard from him. His phone line has gone dead.
He came to a wedding from Abuja. Then the developer, they met there. He said, come and see the work he's working on. Yesterday, before he go back, that is why he was there.
This man had been working at the site but narrowly escaped when the building came down. He says his boss, who is the developer of the project, was not so lucky. He's still trapped in the rubble.
My boss is there.
Your boss is inside there.
Yes, my boss. First floor is in 18th floor.
What's his name, sir?
18th floor with visitor.
What's his name, sir?
First floor.
First floor. Where this place is now is about the 7th or 8th floor now.
We are. This is a 18th floor I'm seeing now. We need to go there now. We need to excavator needs to go to that place now. Please, I'm begging you guys, please.
Rescue personnel are painstakingly and carefully digging through the debris in search of trapped victims.
We're still conducting what we call a search and rescue mission. The site is still a live site. We're still very hopeful because each time they pump oxygen, they pump water into the debris so that if we have survivors, they will still have a chance to continue to breathe. That's why intermittently they do that, and they have the equipment in which they will need to pick sound, if any, and they will do that for about 30 minutes or so before they go, back at work again and continue to do a search, and rescue.
Around the crash site, anxious relatives continue waiting, hanging on to every word of the governor and hoping that their trapped relatives will be brought out of the rubble alive.
So we have a desk that has been set up here where we want family members. Like I said, we do not have a manifest. So anybody that is missing, that you think you must have assumed that maybe came here to work or is a worker here, you will take down the name of the person. If you have a photograph of the person, it will be very, very useful, right? We also want your own name and contact. And there's also been a website that has also been designed, for this, which is help at lagosmind.org.
The Lagos State government has now set up a panel to investigate the incident and make recommendations. It has also suspended the head of the city's building agency and says it is going to conduct integrity tests on all the buildings close to the collapsed structure to ensure that they have not been impacted. Deji Bademasi, CGTN, Lagos.
In Uganda, a group of women is teaching young girls living in Kampala's slums how to make reusable sanitary pads. The United Nations Children's Fund UNICEF says assisting schoolgirls manage menstrual hygiene helps many of them to stay in school. In various parts of the continent, millions of girls skip classes every month because they do not have sanitary pads, which makes it extremely challenging for them to go to school during their menstrual cycles. With how a group in Kampala is trying to change this, here's Isabel Nakira with their story.
Learning how to make reusable sanitary pads has been life-changing for Hafswa Akelo. Unable to afford the cost of disposable pads before was stressful.
Sometimes I fold face towels and use them, but you can't stand it for even 4 hours. It burns and you can get heat rashes.
Hafsa lives with her single mother in Kamocha, one of the biggest slums in Kampala. Most of the families here can barely afford food, let alone sanitary products.
The biggest problem for girls in this slum is getting pads. They even ask people whom they shouldn't be asking. You find a young girl with a man friend because she needs him to give her money for buying pads, which should not be the case.
Hafsa says she would cut corners to ensure she has enough.
When Mom gives me money to go buy food, I save some and use that to buy pads at the end of the month.
Now a group of women is teaching young girls in the slum how to manage menstrual hygiene and save money by using reusable pads. About 50 girls in the slum have been able to gain skills in making reusable pads. Some are school dropouts and are hoping to use these skills in opening up their own tailoring businesses in future. Fine fabric is cut in 2 pieces and the girls stitch them together for use. The rest is sold cheaply to communities in the slum.
They start with their parents. Every week they bring 2,000 shillings. So when we gather that money, at least by 2 weeks we can get material. We can go to a window, buy those cheap things where we can get material. Even the customers, when they buy the completed ones, you can gather the money, give these ones.
Hafsa and dozens of other girls are now able to make their own reusable pads, which can last for more than 2 years if kept clean. The tailoring class is growing and more girls are showing interest in learning these skills. But there are millions of others who continue to miss school every month because they have nothing to use. Isabel Nakiria, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
Well, I'll be standing by to bring you more in Africa Live, including the latest in sport. But now let's take a look at what's happening in the world of business with Rama.
Thank you, Hannah. Here's what's coming up in business news. The IMF nears a debt relief deal with cash-strapped Zambia. We'll have the latest. And economic activity rebounds in Kenya after the lifting of some pandemic restrictions.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Let's start in the world of international debt. The International Monetary Fund is pretty optimistic, in its words, about reaching a lending agreement with Zambia, one of just 3 countries that has sought debt restructuring under the G20 framework. Back in November, Zambia became the first African country to default on its sovereign debt during the pandemic after it failed to keep up with payments on nearly $13 billion of international debt. Specifically, did default on a Eurobond. About a quarter of that debt is held either by China or Chinese entities. President Hakainde Hichilema has pledged to reduce the fiscal deficit, restore economic growth, and review mining policies in Africa's second largest copper producer. Kenya's private sector activity grew faster in October, partly helped by the government's decision to ease some of the pandemic restrictions that were in place to limit the spread of COVID-19. In late October, President Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta lifted a nighttime curfew that had been in place since March 2020, and that's a move that's expected to spur economic activity. The market Stanbic Bank Kenya Purchasing Managers Index went up to 51.4 points in October from 50.4 a month earlier. That 50-point mark separates growth from contraction. Business activity expanded at a much faster pace in the first 5 months. driven by much higher demand and output as well. Now, the improvement in domestic demand was driven by increased client spending, primarily in wholesale and retail trade. The Finance Ministry is forecasting economic growth rates of about 6% this year, compared with a 0.3% contraction in 2020. Foreign direct investment flows into Egypt have fallen by 30% over the last 3 years, partly due to the effects of COVID. Now, the country, however, still did receive the highest amount in FDI over the period compared to other counterparts across the continent. The amount of investment flowing into the country dropped from $7.5 billion to just $5.2 billion. Here's Yasser Kim with the numbers.
A main source of hard currency for Egypt, foreign direct investments have not yet fully recovered from the effects of the coronavirus pandemic.
Foreign investments in the last 6 months reached $3.4 billion against $5 billion in the year before. There is an apparent slowdown. The energy and gas sector are the main attractions for investors after the latest huge gas discoveries. Also, real estate projects and tourism sectors, especially new cities, is encouraging. So, the activity in the real estate as well as building touristic villages and tourist destinations.
Egypt is still a top attractor of foreign direct investments in the continent. However, with its strong infrastructure, economic growth and big population, experts believe it should attract even much more investor inflows. Most of the non-petroleum investments have been in the services and real estate sectors, whilst the government is targeting the manufacturing industries.
After the strong infrastructure built by Egypt and the aggressive economic reforms on the last few years, the base is there to flourish. Now, there must be more emphasis on the industrial sector. It has to be well promoted to attract investors. I think it should prosper soon.
One manufacturer is Amr Fatouh, a top producer of polycarbonate sheets. He says the country has big potential.
Egypt's geographical and strategic location in the center of the world and connecting several continents make it ideal for investments. Egypt's economy has absorbed that shock from the pandemic because we had ongoing mega infrastructure projects which employed a large number of workers and sustained the economy. The challenges we have now are similar everywhere. Problems in shipping, in the supply chain, which has been broken up. We expected and hope it will recover soon.
The government has also been trying to fix a depleted and complicated bureaucratic system that has for decades pushed many investors away. Experts acknowledge the efforts by the state, but say more would be welcomed.
I'm calling on the government to continue on its path to provide more facilities and relax regulations for the local businessmen, because the foreign investor would enter the market when he sees the Egyptian businessmen are succeeding.
Analysts believe once the economic fallout from the coronavirus pandemic is diminished, the FDIs will pour back into the North African country. Yasser Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
On to West Africa. Nigeria, as you might have heard, recently launched Africa's first digital currency. It's legal tender and the direct liability of the central bank. The name is the e-Naira. CGTN's Kelechi Makalam hit the streets of Abuja to get reactions on how citizens there are receiving and using the e-Naira.
The launch of Nigeria's digital currency is seen as a major milestone for the West African nation. Its central bank was averse to cryptocurrency, banning all banks from making such transactions, only to make a U-turn 8 months down the line. But how much traction is the e-Naira gaining so far? Earlier, we asked a few residents if they're keen on investing or transacting through this means. Here's what they had to say.
If there are no charges, I think e-Naira is good to go. But if that charges still remain, e-Naira is not good to go. Let them leave us for who we are and let's move on.
A lot of things in Nigeria now is all about scamming. So now we would have to trust this thing enough to want to do it.
Well, actually, I own a Binance wallet. I would like to invest a little in it and see what I can get from it.
Analysts believe the e-Naira could be economically viable, but government would have to do so much more to get people on board.
Agreed, you say that this would improve cross-border transactions and all that, but how many Nigerians have those necessary gadgets and tools to enable them access and use this platform? And again, you know that there is always the potential of fraudsters getting into that field, and people are wary of what this will mean. Days after launching this, there we had a set of people had already put on a fake social media handle for eNaira. So that to a great extent, again, substantiate the fears of people.
Nigeria is one of a few countries in the world and first in Africa to launch its official digital currency. Cryptocurrency adoption is popular in Nigeria, especially among the youth population. According to 2020 data by trading giant Paxful, the West African nation ranked second place after the US in Bitcoin trade volumes. President Muhammadu Buhari says the eNaira could boost Nigeria's GDP by $29 billion over the next decade. Kelechi Amekalam, CGTN Abuja, Nigeria.
Right then into the world of transportation. The first King Long bus fully assembled in Tunisia has rolled off the production line. The project is part of a partnership with a Chinese firm, a leading bus manufacturer, sold both in China and in other markets around the world.
Medicar's factory is located in the town of Akuda in the coastal city of Sousse in the North African country. The King Long bus is the result of a successful partnership between Tunisia and China in the industrial sector. Medicar's targets an annual production capacity of around 120 buses.
The integration rate is around 42% and it's set to rise. We are planning to increase the production capacity of the factory. We import the rolling frame with the wheels from China, then we build the bus body and the remaining components in this factory.
China's ambassador to Tunisia declared that the first fully assembled Chinese bus, King Long in Sousse, is a good example of the win-win cooperation between China and Tunisia.
I know so many buses in China. From the first sight, I realized that this is a good quality bus in terms of manufacturing. All the international, Chinese and Tunisian technical standards are respected. I think it's a good achievement. I congratulate Medica's group for its capacity in building such good quality buses. Congratulations.
The King Long bus will be used for tourism and intercity travel. Experts say it will improve public and private transport in Tunisia.
This bus seats 53 people, including the driver. It has the latest technical features and luxury accessories, as well as robustness and rigidity, allowing it to cover long distances. It's equipped with comfortable seats, Wi-Fi, cameras, and top security. The bus has a panoramic view and 900 cubic meters of storage capacity.
In 2019, Chinese car manufacturer Geely inaugurated its first assembly unit in Sousse in partnership with Medicars and Zweri Industrial and Economic Group. The assembly line for the new bus has created 320 direct and indirect jobs in Tunisia. Medicars aims to supply the Maghreb and African markets with this bus model in partnership with the Chinese giant King Long. Adnan Shawashi, CGTN, Tunis.
And I'll leave it there for the time being, but I'll be back at the top of the hour. We'll be exploring trade ties between the United States and Ethiopia. At that point in time, the US has said from the 1st of January 2022, Ethiopia is going to lose its AGOA access privileges, given the civil war that's going on in that particular country. But how exactly will that play out? What are the effects on jobs, on investment, and much more? We'll explore that live from Addis Ababa and elsewhere at 1800 GMT. For now, back to Hannah.
We'll see you at the top of the hour. For now, let's take a short break and return your sport news, including we bring you the story of a former gang member turned champion athlete in South Africa.
How would you create your legend? On the fields, on the tracks, in the arenas of Africa. Were you born to be a player? Could this moment be yours? Sports Scene. Find your game.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Time now for the sports news. South Africa's Siwongile Chikija, an athlete who beat all odds to become a champion and one of South Africa's top trail runners. Siwongile now runs a small club on the Cape Flats where he trains and mentors young children to stay away from street life. CGTN's Julie Shire brings us his story.
Running comes easy for champion trail runner Siwongile Chikija. He did it every morning as a child, covering 10 kilometers before school to fetch water for his family in the rural Eastern Cape. But was almost robbed of that talent, trying to escape poverty through a criminal lifestyle.
I was one to be one of the girls who famous because of robbing. Like at night I was robbing people